Hello everyone, my presentation is entitled Holding the Government Accountable in COVID-19 Lockdowns, Cameroon, Caloocan City. Last year in March 2020, the COVID-19 lockdown coincided with our graduate class in engaged ethnography. With Professor Rosales' mentorship, we were tasked to write an ethnography from the comforts of our home and as an output for the graduate class. Through Professor Rosales' existing and long-lasting connection with the NGO Urban Poor Associates, we were each paired up with a community leader with whom we were to co-write a thought piece on the urban poor situation during the pandemic. In this presentation, I talk about how a community leader helped her barangay, or in the Philippines, the smallest government unit, during COVID-19 lockdowns, what challenges they faced, why the writing of stories for an online news website is important, and what this says about the futures of digital ethnography. The most important question that framed our research as graduate students was why and how to continue doing ethnography. I argued that in the Philippines, doing ethnography amidst COVID-19 lockdown was a necessary challenge to articulate the continuing structural injustices that made living in the dense city of Metro Manila, Philippines, already precarious for the urban poor even before the pandemic. I'm guided by the use of digital ethnography as a choice and not as a necessity, according to Goralska. Goralska maintains that anthropologists are well suited to quote-unquote inquire in depth into the pandemic with a code of conduct to, quote, act for common good, end quote. She uses the term anthropology from home to describe the nature of ethnography online or digital ethnography. This kind of ethnography was also, she argues, geographically restricted but digitally enabled. She posits its potential for anthropologists to look further into global structures and locations of power, cultural practices, and social phenomenon in a time when on-site ethnographic work is impossible. While Goralska's digital ethnography involved looking at network politics and lurking online, digital ethnography in my work here meant weekly phone calls with a community leader, surfing the internet to validate information on the news, and also publishing for the public online. Moreover, the internet was essential to sharing vital information among community members in Facebook groups. Thus, digital ethnography also meant understanding the role of our collaboration online as a writing of a historical moment. I collaborated with community leader Malu. Malu is a senior citizen and has lived in her community since the 1980s when it was still underdeveloped. She is the secretary of the Camarine Balikatan Associations Inc., a people's organization in a barangay, which is a village or district in Camarine, Caloocan at the northern part of Metro Manila. She rents a small house with her husband, her 5 children, and 8 grandchildren. With her husband sick from a stroke, their whole family depends on her 2 sons who work while she cares for her grandchildren. She finished only second year in college and has always been involved in advocating for social justice for the poor. Her knowledge and experience in community leadership goes far beyond just the COVID-19 pandemic. Her barangay is populated by so-called informal settlers who developed strong community organizations capacities through the efforts of various people's organizations, many of which Malu has been an active member. With the assistance of community organizers from the UPA, her community sought for the right to stay in their land. The organization has continually fought for the community's right to the land, access to water, electricity, proper roads, and social services. Throughout the years, she has been witness to how community development is also politicized by those in power. For example, in 1994, the PO struck a deal with a local politician who was running for barangay councilor during that year's elections. In exchange for their votes, the politician would help the community apply for inclusion in the National Electrification Program for depressed areas and government programs that provide electricity. 2 years later, they lost their access to electricity and the politician was nowhere to be found. In 2018, with the support of UPA and other politicians, again, a resolution was passed officially transforming the land that they lived in into a housing subdivision. Our conversation for this project emerged from listening through static, listening while typing, and going back and forth with questions and clarifications. Malu recounted her COVID-19 experience to me from 2020 to 2021. In April 2020, we wrote about the increasing worries and anxieties of people in her community at the start of the lockdowns in Manila. We focused on the anxieties of the poor losing income almost overnight, food insecurity, hesitancy in trusting the government programs to work, and calls for more support from private sectors to that hire laborers contractually. The government mandated the Social Amelioration Program, or SAP, to mitigate the socio-economic impact of the pandemic. Lower income families were given a total of 16,000 pesos, or approximately $320, given in two tranches. Families were also given food packs from both private and public organizations. Our co-written article starts with her cuento, or her story. She says leaders like us and people's organizations are practicing the Bayanihan spirit. We help one another work with the government and try to keep our hopes up in the face of an uncertain future. We are doing our part and call on benefactors to continue helping, donating, and providing assistance so that fellow Filipinos like us survive this crisis. I then write from her story a week later after they heard about the cash assistance through the Department of Social Welfare and Development and the local government unit. The barangay enlisted the help of presidents of local associations and people's organizations to distribute the application forms to the SAP. Balikatan, which is Malu's community organization, received only 100 social amelioration cards for its 450 family members. That meant only 100 families could receive cash assistance in her own sitio. Malu's association decided to follow the clusters their NGO partner UPA had earlier established to organize their community. They decided to convene as an organization and decide whom among the families are most vulnerable with only the SAP to depend on to survive. Malu concludes, in our place, we are doing what we can to coordinate with the government. We are ready, organized, and empowered. We trust that the government will do its best to fulfill its duties so we can survive. Thus, and I write this on the online article, at the level of the barangay, leaders are making deliberate choices for the good of those in need and are willing to do the necessary work to surmount the crisis. The article was published in 2 parts online, and noticeable in the interface of the article was all the ad placements selling products at different intervals of the article. So a short timeline in between last year and this year, as I am continuing our research. Between the publishing of the article and our writing of another article today, online news publications kept up to date about the issues surrounding the Social Amelioration Program. In May 2020, it was reported that 23 barangay officials were charged for SAP anomaly and distribution. Then in July 2020, for his 5th State of the Nation address, Duterte said, admittedly, our implementation of the SAP was not perfect. At the start of January 2021 this year, the Social Weather Station released data that only 69% of the families surveyed received the government's cash subsidy. In March 2021, the enhanced community quarantine cash aid was given to aid people in dealing with the limits of yet another strict lockdown through 22.9 billion pesos leftover funds from the Bayanihan Act last year. Then in June 2021, the government approved a 3rd stimulus package worth 400 billion pesos. It was in this context from April to June that Malu and I developed another story as a review of the problems her communities face a year after. Malu announced that some families indeed received 1,000 to 4,000 pesos worth of cash aid or ayuda. However, many questions arose. Some people did not receive the SAP tranches last year and questioned if funds this year were coming from the money that was not properly distributed. Are people in the Senate only pushing this to get the votes of the mass sphere? Our proposed article this year was written entirely from Malu's perspective and had English and Tagalog versions because it was important that her community members understand the complexities of the larger system of governance. So our conversation through the phone meant back and forth between us through phone and text, both in English and Tagalog versions. She recounted problems and misinformation on the nature of COVID-19, vaccine hesitancy, lack of access to health care for other needs, anxieties of mothers helping children learn through online education, lack of employment opportunities, and again, the SAP distribution. She writes about the SAP distribution. The government heads asked the help of people's organization leaders such as My People's Organization in distributing and submitting again the social amelioration cards for families per sitio. Some received first and or second tranches promised last year through the first round of SAC submissions. A second round of SAC went to those who were not included in the first round of submissions. They were promised 16,000 pesos to make up for the missed second tranches when these SACs were submitted to the barangay. Lists are posted on Facebook daily for those who were scheduled to receive their payout. Despite the new pronouncements for ECQ cash aid, a year later some have still not received their first and second tranches from the SAP last year. We decided to document cases of people who did not receive the SAP this year and last year. For example, a 23-year-old father with 4 kids and one on the way received his first tranche. Although he received the first 4,000 cash aid for this year, the promised second tranche from last year never followed. Again, another one is a 23-year-old mother who lives with her parents and her 19-year-old husband. This year, they received the 4,000 pesos cash aid, but again, no sign of the additional tranche from last year, even if they signed up for it. With these problems, Malu reflects, if only the poorest of the poor are supposed to get the SAP, why is it that those who don't get the SAP are no better than those who do? It ends up being about luck. Why is it that some really are down with their luck? No matter how hard they look for work and how often they submit their SACs, they don't get anything or only a part. People are left to wait and wait to watch for signs and test their luck with the system. Thus, today, Malu and her community leaders continue to figure out how to ensure the people get the cash assistance they were promised and told to apply for. Names, however, seem to slip through the system and do not appear when official lists of beneficiaries' names are given. These kinds of lived experiences of the cracks in the systems were what we intended to publish. However, when I submitted this article a week ago for publishing, the news website had to decline because much of the content had quote-unquote already been discussed in previous pieces. To which Malu replied, "Araw-araw ang balita, walang nagbabago," or news is published every day, but nothing new is happening. Reflecting on these two collaborations, I argue that collaborations such as these are important because of how they hold the government accountable through a recounting of their lived realities, which is both agentive and critical in nature. I follow Filipino scholar and activist Chester Arcelia's definition of engagement in anthropology to draw out its criticality. First, Arcelia frames collaborators and engaged research as partner subaltern historian. He writes, "Engaged anthropology has great potential for political empowerment of the scholar activist and subaltern historian, as well as generates epistemologically complex ethnographic narratives. Engaging with urban poor leaders thus has the potential to resist subaltern exclusions and assumptions of a lack of history, which results in, quote, the subsumption within master narratives of the subaltern perspectives and official document and academic writing." For example, one columnist in a pro-Duterte newspaper wrote in May 2021, "In Malu's views, the government is indeed addressing it, however not without systemic corruption. But painting the urban poor as a, quote, national security is a gross assumption about the urban poor's agenda. Second, the positionality of the researcher needs to be constantly interrogated. As someone belonging to a somewhat upper middle-class family with no trouble surviving the pandemic, I am surrounded by everyday discourses surrounding government that assumes that because they pay less tax, the poor have less of a right to government aid. However, learning from Malu's history, their struggles have always been systemic in nature, and theirs is only one of the many low-income family communities. It was thus a personal and political necessity for me to bring out these narratives. Third, engaged ethnography must, quote-unquote, be socially located within structural neoliberal violence and a constitution of subjectivities. Thus, the activist scholar's politics and mode of engagement must necessarily be contextualized within changing community micropolitics, where intra-subaltern contestations reflect constrained and shifting strategies in response to neoliberal government technologies. Because our collaboration involved a meeting of our asymmetric positionalities, it is also a knowledge production from the context of what Wataru Kusaka calls the contact zone where both civic and mass spheres meet. Kusaka uses an example in the early 2000s when Metro Manila Development Agency mandated crackdowns on the urban poor vendors in service of a cleaner and more disciplined city for neoliberalist agenda. What was important in his findings was that mass sphere, or the urban poor sector, is shown to have their own ways of operating within an informal economy against the law, but as a way to assert their rights to the city. What is different in Malu's community is that they actually work with the law and yet do not fully receive the rights to resources that they were promised. The main intention for publishing the article was thus to challenge the historical framing of urban poor community as perhaps pasaway or undisciplined for some in the civic sphere or in the academic sphere. Thus, for the both of us, engaging with each other enabled us to practice our agency of projects in Ortner's terms, where agency is also a power which enables individuals to dominate or resist, and agency of projects enable individuals to pursue their own projects with their own intentional outcomes. In the end, when I asked if our collaboration was agentive in any way, she tells, nadadagdagan ang kaalaman at nababahagi ito sa community. Or knowledge is added and this is shared with the community. Regardless of its second publication, the projects she takes up are also beneficial to the community as they continuously pursue their rights in the city and for a better life. Thus, I conclude that digital ethnography for anthropology from home is indeed helpful to cope with the changing times and to document subaltern histories or lived experiences from the mass sphere, but understand that their knowledge and lived experiences that we try to learn from have a longer history that went far beyond the COVID-19. It also has a potential to depict alternative, counter-hegemonic narratives of the poor. Although it is anthropology from home and involves phone calls, we must remember that this dialogue operates beyond the phone call and is situated in a larger context beyond our collaboration of past and present. Because digital ethnography, although seemingly out of the field site, still operates within larger systems of knowledge exchange, and digital ethnography must be cognizant of that. Thank you.